Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking TRM. I'm going to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where this one's going to go. I'm nervous. For some reason, I've been trying to get this gentleman on, I say gentleman with love and respect. I have been trying to get this gentleman onto the podcast since the very beginning because, in my humble opinion, well, not only did he get me into this world, but actually much, much more importantly than that, really built the frameworks around what we even know as what we now know is risk management, but way before that, disaster recovery and business continuity. The reason I'm nervous is because, well, when you know who it is, you'll know why I'm nervous. This could go any way at all. And he's a lot more witty than I am. So I'm probably going to end up in circles here, but we'll give it a go. So without further ado, I've known this gentleman for close into 3 years now. We've never actually met in person. Goodness knows what will happen when we do. I think we're keeping it away for good reason. But I speak to him a lot. I would not be doing what I'm doing without him. So without further ado, if I could ask you, my dear guest, who are you and what do you do?
Well, I'm Russell Price. I've known Bex for about 3 years. It feels about 30 years. But really, I suppose the core of the conversation today is about my role in risk resilience and trying to make the world a little bit better a piece at a time. And my way of doing that is working through standards. I chair the standards committee for ISO. And many of you listening into this show will realize that the 31030 standard from ISO is a big shift forward for the travel risk industry, for those working in travel management generally. And it's based on a lifetime spent trying to avoid trouble or learning from the experience of trouble. And I think in my life, it's about 50-50. I get into a lot of trouble and I have to work a way out of it. So that's given me a foundation that I've been able to share with others. I also work through BSI in a whole range of standards, and that cuts into information security, the developing thinking around sustainability, environmental work, and so on, but always with a focus on decision making and trying to make business better by doing better business. And it's connecting those things in a way that yields real value for end users. This is not a tick box exercise for me, and it certainly shouldn't be for you. It's about making a positive difference and creating that positive change. That's me.
In a nutshell. Thank you so much, Russell. So we were introduced, let's start with 31030 because it was certainly the start of our relationship. So we were introduced through various organizations who were on those sort of final committees as we were pushing through the final versions of the standard and the reviews and getting to that sort of public review piece. And then we had a conversation a few months afterwards where you asked me a really pertinent question, and I talk about it quite a lot on these podcasts. So to actually be able to kind of discuss it with you here it would be great. So you said to me, what do you think are the barriers of 31030 hitting its sort of maximum effect in the way that we would want it to? And my response was, after sort of saying, I love the standard, Russell, just so you know. I'm going to just like throw my job in and totally change my career around it because of this standard. But other than that, the barrier that I saw to entry was a sort of lack of awareness and perhaps evolution within the travel industry itself. Because I think it's fair to say that the writing of 31030 didn't necessarily have input from the entirety of the travel industry. It was much more sort of security and assistance led. Would that be fair?
I don't think it is actually.
Go on, tell me not. Yes, good.
I think the thing that you first of all have to understand about standards and maturity is if you look at the office environment, if you look when you get onto a train, a plane, an automobile, when you pick up a computer, you're already using standards-based products and services because they are woven into the very fabric of our society. at an intimate level. You can't make anything or do anything without following or touching on areas that have benefited from standards. And you've got to ask yourself the question, why? And the answer to that is because they work. They help create transformation. And that transformation is from something that was maybe okay, but not great, into something that is better, that we can all benefit from. And I think when you're looking at particularly travel risk, it is an atypical subject. Certainly it was when it was first broached. And my experience of this goes back to someone who you should have on this, on Talking TRM, Rico Luzzi, who was presenting to us in the business continuity, security, resilience space at the Guildhall 10, 12 years ago. And he was doing a master's thesis. Now, I'd already had a lot of experience in that security environment, working around counterterrorism with City of London Police, Metropolitan Police, a lot of standards-based thinking, operational performance-based thinking. But what became clear was experiences that we all shared, we hadn't learned from. And we hadn't curated an industry approach that could benefit hundreds of millions of business travelers. And it is that I think is where I would differentiate it, because business travel today is not about just moving a person from point A to point B. It is about supporting them on their journey and how they work in those spaces. So you've already had commentators on this in the Talking TRM podcasts, speaking about information security, talking about wellness, looking at the reasons to travel and how that is evolving and changing as global society changes. And I think one of the things that was almost prescient, and for the life of me, it worries me that for so many years people had got so lax. There was generally a price per seat, a price per room. There was very little thought applied to the detail of business travel. And there were some personal reasons in the background there as well, why maybe we could do things a little bit better and maybe avoid some of the incidences that you and I are frequent occurrences when people are traveling, not just for business, but more generally.
So I think then that's the key difference, isn't it? That this was always around the end. I'm not going to get into the end user debate because the end user of a standard is a different thing. So let's talk about the travelers. This standard was built around those people traveling. And obviously for the sake of 31030, that's people traveling for organizations. And in the case of the newer standard that's imminently arriving, if it hasn't already arrived, which is 31031, looking at that same set, but thinking about youth travel instead. So this is quite different then to perhaps other standards that maybe businesses have considered. And I guess I come from the business end. So obviously when I first was introduced to standards, actually, I have to be honest, it was really negative, not from a perspective of what the standard does, but just from the way the business considered standards. And it's something that I have really had to, well, it's changed for me as I've obviously got more involved, because I've suddenly realized it was very much put to me, standards are there to stop you kind of working and to make you kind of, it's going to be a pain to get this through. And that's across various organizations that I've worked for. And what I learned really quickly as soon as I got into this is that is not what this is about at all. There's nobody sort of sitting in a room saying, thou will do this. This is accumulation of experts, hopefully within the industry that they're writing the standard for, to come together and say, firstly, do we want something in this space? And if we do, what does that look like? And how do we then evolve it? Which is exactly what, the birthplace of 31030 was around, right? It came from British businesses asking questions and sort of suggesting that they wanted to have a standard in this area, and they went to BSI and and on it went from there. But it's a really long process. And I think to have got to where we've got to now is incredible in the time that we've done it. But where do you sort of see this going, sort of with the regards to other, going back to my initial question around, you asked me the sort of boundaries and the areas that would stop this from evolving. What, in your opinion, is stopping it from evolving?
Well, I think a lot of the barriers are already crumbling because of the momentum that's been built and, frankly, the logical argument. But I think the barriers were the attitude that you just displayed, that there is a travel risk, a travel management perspective that didn't have much experience of standards. If you're an engineer in the electronic space, you cannot develop your products without standards, because pretty much every component in your phone, in your computer, is dependent on standards. If you're looking at building a good quality program, you need standards. If you're looking at managing environmental services in your organization, you need good standards. And some of these will be certification standards, and I'm sure we'll come to this later on. But those certifications give you, at the simplest level, a badge. But what that badge is a confirmation that you are saying what needs to be done and you're doing that properly. And there is an assurance to stakeholders, to investors, to the wider society that you're responsible. And that exists in a whole area of standards. There's then another group of standards that are more aimed at guidance. And the guidance isn't so prescriptive that you have to pass an exam, but it provides you with a shape of what good looks like. It's good practice guidance. Now, that's typically the sort of thing that happens in risk management. And there are two things that I think kick in here. The first is that risk management itself is pretty much all encompassing. It's about making good decisions that keep you safe or that can help you exploit opportunities to make money or to extend environmental programs, whatever it might be. It's about decision making. But once you've written a standard for that, and that is an ISO standard 31000, it gives you a framework and principles, and it all plugs together neatly. It's infinitely variable. You've got a great tool, but it's now down to you to use that. And how you choose to use it is more flexible sometimes than the certification options. Now, earlier on, there was this resistance to having a standard for travel risk because it should be part of risk management. But when we were doing the prep and the research to see what existed in this space, there was the Blue Book from ABTA. There were a few guidance standards in specific areas like security. There was some information that you could get from places like the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, sources of information that you had to interpret and work with. And actually, there was nothing that really brought it all together in a way that was usable by organizations large and small. And notice I've introduced small here. I think a lot of the focus on the industry is at very much the corporate end of the business travel environment. Yet, well over half of our country's GDP here in the UK is based on smaller firms who are increasingly trading on the global stage. They have virtually no experience of how to travel safely and securely. So what does good look like to them? And how should TMCs and other stakeholders in this area perhaps refine and adapt their approach to deliver value add for that completely new market sector? People that they're not reaching with their services at the moment, who are carrying on with their business in blissful ignorance, may be getting away with it, but sometimes not. So the idea of the standard is to fit something into an ecosystem that protects everyone, and this goes back to the kind of duty of care legal obligations that exist around the world, but also to recognize the opportunity to learn from industry. And there was a lot of consultation with different types of organizations, from those working in the security space, those working with travel bookings, those working in the tech sector, the big corporates talking about how frustrating they had found it, IT guys saying, oh God, it's so insecure out there. You know, we don't know how to protect our people. And when we do tell them how to do it, they ignore it anyway. So getting a healthy culture for the discussion around risk was our first step. And that informed the guidance. But once you've got guidance in place, and if you read the standard, you'll see that it connects with the broader risk management within almost any organization, whether or not you're a FTSE 100 company or whether or not you're a small company. You can adapt what it says pretty much at a granular level in a way that helps you do a better job. And that, to me, is the great success of it. But it's incomplete and part of a bigger work in progress as well. And that work in progress is a cultural change in the travel industry. At the moment, every hotel booking site I go to, every service that I might look to purchase or use, I will get things like star ratings. The gym is 5-star. You know, you've got the business center. You've got chocolates on your pillow. There's nothing to tell me more than that. And actually, in terms of security, I'm not sure I can trust what I'm being told. And certainly when I look for evidence, when I visit venues, hotels, I don't trust it. When I look at how people recount their stories to me, which I get all the time, I very rarely hear about positive experiences. It is a catalogue of shortcuts, and it's not malicious. It's a lack of focus.
And I can completely understand why there's that lack of focus, you know, because the travel industry providers in corporate travel, for sure, are very led by the organizations. And the organizations, unfortunately, aren't really on top of their programs, perhaps in the way they should be, because of the way that those programs are managed internally. So for many, many years now, travel's been seen as a cost to control, and therefore measured from a procurement and finance, managed from a procurement and finance perspective, without perhaps thinking about all of the other industries, which, when you put a travel risk hat on, allows you to open up the conversation and bring in your people managers, bring in your QHSE, bring in your data and your cybersecurity and your general security. But again, the challenge that SMEs and smaller organizations will be thinking is, well, we don't have any of those. And that is the beauty of this standard. So just to kind of go back to what you were just saying then, you can grow with it. And actually, if you use it as a startup, you know, I'm talking to people about this all the time. You know, as a startup, your 4 or 5 most important people in the company will be your execs traveling around the world trying to sell your idea. So from that very, very startup point, there's a point that you can start using this, and you evolve and you grow with it. So Russell, I know that there's a couple of things I just wanted to dive into. So I want to talk about this evidence-based piece, because I know so the good news is there are solutions out there that are now really thinking about this from a different side and looking at ways that actually they can help travel managers get that evidence base that they needed, that they had 50 or 60 years ago, when there weren't so many options available to them, and we didn't change the way that we book travel. So but using technology in innovative ways to be able to do that. So it's good news. But then it comes down to the training and actually what happens. So I don't know if you're going to share us with any of this stuff, but you know, what are some of the things that you perhaps look for or have been maybe known to do if you are on a property?
Well, for myself, I'll give you one example. I travel extensively, as you would expect. And ISO, the International Standards Organization, also, when we're taking the mickey, we also call it the International Sightseeing Organization, because, you know, it's remarkable how the allure of Buenos Aires or Baku or Dublin or London is around the world. You get to travel and see a lot of things. But there's me, one of their subject matter experts, and we might be going to a conference, and I say to them, okay, what about insurance? Simple thing like, what about insurance? Oh, you're covered. We have insurance for you. Do you? Do you really?
Mm.
I have an existing medical condition. Therefore, does your insurance cover me? No. Therefore, because I asked the question, because I am more risk aware, I'm able to make my own provisions that protect me and make sure I go to places where I can be treated should there be an incident. If you hadn't asked that question, if I hadn't asked that question, who would be liable? Because I'm not employed by ISO, I volunteer. And in the court cases
Yeah.
that were to follow on, what kind of a mess could that be?
Mm.
This is
Yeah.
such a simple thing. You might work with a contractor. Are you insuring them for travel? Are they insuring themselves for travel? Is their insurance sufficient to cover the information that might be proprietary to your client, and who is responsible? Time and time again, there are these issues that can crop up and complicate matters and add huge expense. Going back into the dim and distant past, some of the reasons that I've got fairly firm views on taking the time to think about what could be at issue is experience with staff that worked for me more than 30 years ago, and some quite serious assaults that happened whilst they were traveling for business, and it ruined their lives. One was terribly assaulted, and they ended up taking their own life. And in that context, you look at the great work you're doing with these things, Bex, around wellness. I found that whole episode difficult because we weren't prepared. We didn't know what to do. It was the era of young, innovative tech companies growing, that exuberance and energy, and perhaps more enthusiasm than competence to manage certain situations. And in the middle of that, you're sitting there learning a very hard lesson that maybe we could have done better. And in the cold light of day, yes, we could have done better. So what do? Do you decide to make better choices after that? And that's something that we've done. I've had people who've started working with us that are surprised. I find this shocking, that are surprised that when we have people working with us, we do welfare checks every day. Without question, it takes 2 minutes. Are you okay? Are you happy? Are the clients okay? Are they happy? It takes 2 minutes. And it's fundamental to the quality of work that you do. And my argument in all of this has always been, if you don't care about your people, how are you going to care about your customers? How are you going to show that you actually mean business in the best way possible? And for me, that is about being very clear on what we can and can't do. And sometimes we can't do things, and we might walk away from certain situations. And I think in a challenging world, certainly during COVID, there was a lot of concern about how we were all going to cope. But some of us were able to pivot very positively because we had great relationships with our staff. They trusted us to care and not put them into positions where they might feel exposed or vulnerable or undervalued. And when you're looking at coming out of those situations, you find the loyalty you showed them was paid back in abundance. And that's something that I think you can have as a small business, but also as a large corporate. I think it's part of the principles and values of organizations. Care about your people, care about your customers. So in the context of the legal duty of care, that's where I come from. But it's ever so useful if you approach it with that mindset when you are challenged on what you do and why. The problem was, prior to 31,030, you didn't have a basis that you could use as good practice. that would identify it as recognized. And I can't remember who it was. I don't think it was Bruce, but one of your other speakers, I think that was Frank Harrison. He said you can't certify to ISO 31030. That is not quite accurate. ISO certification, the full independent assessment guidance standards aren't written for that. There is a technical difference that we have to acknowledge that exists. But you can self-audit. You can have a second party audit. So any organization can align with 31,000 and say, we are following all of these pieces of the guidance that keep our people safe and secure, that keep your products and services safe whilst they're in our custody. All of that sort of thing happening. But we're not going to go further than that at the moment because there isn't a standard that fills that space. But you can verify. And in fact, that's the basis of a lot of other industry development that ISO's seen over the past few decades. A lot of people choose not to certify to business continuity standards. But what they choose to do is to align those standards to their operations and then share those findings with key suppliers or customers. So they're able to produce that evidence of capability, and it's caring about customers, caring about people, caring about your business. So that's where we are in the maturity side at the moment. The standard, I couldn't believe how quickly we broke down some of the initial barriers. And I think now we're in a space where pretty much every time that I look at conference agendas or people in the industry are talking with me, they're not just raising it because of my role as ISO chairman. They're raising it with me because they want to see how their business can develop, because both the user community and the supply community, the products and services, recognize they can add value to the relationship and do business better.
Oh, Russell. Thank you. You really went there, and I was really, really grateful because I really wanted. No, but I did tell you to, and I wasn't sure that you would, and I wanted to draw some stuff out of you, and in the end, I didn't need to. And I think it's really easy for people when they think about ISO standards just to go, oh, like I sort of did at the beginning, and that is not where this stuff came from, and it is not where any of this development came from either. Ultimately, when we were talking about risk management and travel risk management, we're talking about keeping people ultimately, but also assets and reputation and everything else that comes with it safe. And it wasn't, just a group of people sitting in a room going, oh, how are we going to make life more difficult for all those business owners? What hoops are we going to make them jump through now? That is not what this is about. And it's never where it came from.
Absolutely the opposite, Bex. It is absolutely the opposite. If you look at the big public inquiries that occur in this country and around the world, where you see standards not being applied properly is where you see the big catastrophes, where you see those human tragedies, where you see the waste and failure. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's the PPE scandal, whether or not it's Grenfell, whatever it might be. When you fail to set standards, expectations, and so on, people will take shortcuts that exploit people, that make the wrong people more money or cost lives. Standards are always about positive values. And sometimes, yeah, you're going to have to pay a little bit to be a little bit safer, a little bit more secure. But what's the choice? Do you still want lead paint on your kids' toys? Are you trying to say seatbelts don't work? These are all things that society learns over time, and recognize in a global market now, whenever you travel, you move from environments where you have experience and a personal level of support networks that can keep you safer into unfamiliar environments. And those unfamiliar environments, you can create real opportunity to expand and develop perspectives and so on. But also you're encountering situations that might need some kind of consistency. And I would contest that security, consistent approaches to healthcare, recognizing where you might be vulnerable, and whether or not that's me with health, it might be gender issues, it might be if you're in Iceland and you decided to go to the southwest of Iceland where you experience volcanic activity today. Things will change, and that's the nature of life. Having the ability to manage big problems and react to fast onset events is an asset.
100%. And thank you for underlining that, because this is exactly what the message that I want our listeners to hear. And the fact that, you know, when it comes to, if we bring this back to the travel piece, your travelers and their families and their dependents and their friends want to know that you've got this stuff in place. There's no question of it. And if anything, if COVID did anything for this industry, it brought it very, very clear into the light that actually companies were underprepared, and coming back are underprepared.
I want to make a point there as well. I think you can very easily become dissociated from the role of the leadership in organizations. I can remember going back to the Ladbroke Grove rail disaster, and if you look at the footage around, and I'm not going to go into detail, and you'll see why in a second. You look at the footage, you will see some personalities who are there, attentive, or working hard in a tragic environment. There was one of the leaders of one of the biggest agencies involved who was very high profile on the ground. He showed that by being there, ever present, working hard. A number of others were not present. They had been advised by the crisis team, the PR team, stay away from this. You know, the optics don't look good. Who do you want to work for? What kind of a company do you want to be a party to? Do you want to see leadership that stand up for the principles and values of a company that says customers and people are important to us? Customers are people. People first. Whatever the service is, they're used by people, and they are us. So anything we do, we have to take account of. But sometimes I feel, and this is true in the travel management space, I feel as though people are unwilling to have the difficult conversations. And they're unwilling to have the difficult conversations because a pattern of behaviors has presented itself, which is faster, cheaper, rather than we want to keep the best experience at the front of our minds for our people. But isn't it interesting? Again, in one of the other interviews, they spoke about how people were coming from the first class carriage back to talk to the peasants about what they wanted to do, and then retreated back to the first class cabin. I don't have a problem with the benefits of seniority, but I do think the experience should be safe and secure equally for everyone. And in that context, recognition that the leadership sets an example first and foremost by listening to the concerns of travel managers. And I would encourage any travel manager, any travel service provider to look at how we can educate the leadership of organizations on the value of travel management. Because one thing's for sure, if you need someone to deal with a health crisis, if you need someone to deal with a major security incident, and this can include things like kidnap and ransom, or something more mundane, a serious mugging, you know, these are things that can happen, and statistically, at some point, it's going to happen to you. And it is, I can assure you, better to be prepared and capable than to be lost and alone in that situation.
I was about to ask you for your top tips, Russell, and there we are. I'm going to take those as them because I think this is the overall message, isn't it? And we talk about this again and again on this podcast. We're living in a world now where things happen. They've always happened. They're never going to stop happening. And we be it the big, huge things that happen that affect hundreds or thousands of people, all the smaller things that only in theory affect one. As you pointed out earlier, that one incident can completely ruin or affect somebody's life or how they choose to, whatever happens to them in the end, which is just, it's huge. I read something recently, and a rather large kind of organization in the UK published sort of saying, it's very unlikely that you're going to have an incident while you're away. We actually only recorded 45 incidences in 23. Well, first of all, the data set was questionable. But
Correct.
secondly, I was like, that's still 45 major incidences that have affected those people. Can we not just make it a stat and go, well, it's only a few? When we're talking about duty of care and travel risk management and people risk management, we're talking about every trip, every person, every time, as to the best of your ability, and to be proactive around that. So
I think there's proportionality. You've got to be proportionate to it. And one of the criticisms I think we rightly suffered was that why not general travel? When we approved the standard, we selected business travel. And we selected that because we could use the anchor of that duty of care. It then became obvious that we should extend that into youth travel. And that's where agencies need to happen. And that standard is now available, I'm pleased to say. And this is something that is going to help those taking on board that responsibility, and giving our kids that life experience of seeing other parts of the world and it being positive. But that's not the end of it. We have to go further and dig a little bit deeper, because the positive reaction to the standard, the benefits it can bring, we know that there's a stage 2. And we can't talk about it in this podcast, but I look forward to coming back and adding some more detail in the future.
Russell, thank you so much. As I'm sure you know, we've gone slightly over our time, but it was worth it. I want to call you the godfather of risk management, but that seems really unfair.
It's always
it's been
effort. Always.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I can't thank you enough for all the work that you've done historically to get us to this place and to open our eyes, amongst others. I know that you're actually really humble in this space and you won't take all the credit for it at all. But it's about having these difficult conversations, because the only way we make positive change is to have these difficult conversations. And people risk management and travel risk management span and allow you to have these difficult conversations that perhaps were not actually that easy to have before. You can actually talk to people personally about their life because you need to keep them safe. It's not that you're going to run around and tell everybody else about them, but there is a way and a mechanism doing that. And that's the conversation we should be having.
This is the privilege of working within standards, because it creates the safe space to share those experiences, and everyone has a horror story. And when you put it all together, you realize how much could be avoided if we thought a little more and paid attention to some of the specifics that actually are pretty simple to do. Everyone can manage travel risk with a little bit of preparation and with a little bit of forethought.
100%. And that's a beautiful segue. Thank you. So for those of you who are obviously listening to us every couple of weeks, you'll have noticed that we have changed our format slightly. So we have Talk'n TRM, the podcast, which comes out every month now. It was coming out fortnightly last year, but that's because we've opened our doors on the same channel to a sister podcast called Talk'n TRM, the Traveller Files. And this is in a hope that we actually start having these conversations with the travelers, those horror stories that Russell was just talking about, sometimes legendary status stories when you get back into the office and actually the dust has settled and you realize that you had another near miss, but they're not always near misses. So we really wanted to bring that to the front. So hopefully you will have we'll have had a couple now, but keep listening to that, because we're going to continue to talk to experts like Russell in this podcast, but we also want to hear from the travellers themselves. And by merging these two things together, we can actually do the work that we want to do and evolve in the way that we want to. Russell, thank you so much. I know how busy you are. Utterly grateful that you've come on this podcast and shared your, not just your wisdom and your expertise, but I think the passion and the drive that sits behind this. I've known you obviously over this time, and we don't ever gossip, unfortunately, Russell. I don't have time to do that. But I was aware of some of the driving force behind what makes him get up every day and do this, because it's not easy when you're trying to change the world. And I really wanted to get that across, and I think you did that beautifully. So thank you. Is there any closing comments you would like to leave to our listeners?
Yeah, I think that you guys that are leading the charge, carrying the flag in the sector, are doing a great job. And I think one of the things that I want to say to the travel management industry is that you demand more recognition for the value of your work. What you do enables your company to succeed around the world. It keeps people safe and secure. And once you start using standards, once you start engaging in that way with your board, what you'll do is you're elevating the professionalism and the contribution and the recognition that you deserve. And I would very much hope that you get some of the credit that is so sorely overdue.
Thank you, Russell. Thank you. Now we're just going to giggle. Do you have to come off screen? Thank you, Russell. Thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for inspiring me to do the work that I do. And I think together we can hopefully professionalize and help these travel managers get to where they need to get. So watch the space on all of that soon too. So you have been listening to Talking TRM, the podcast, with Travel Risk Bex, also known as Bex Deadman, but I like to go by Travel Risk Bex these days, and the wonderful Russell Price. We will be back with you in another couple of weeks with our Traveller Files episode, and then another episode of Talking TRM a couple of weeks after that. Stay safe. Thank you for listening, and get in touch if you've got any questions. Thank you. Bye.